This lecture follows the myths of creation, looking at how Zeus became commander-in-chief in the ancient Greek world and the cosmos. Now we turn to the origin of mortals, and exactly where did man and woman come from according to this civilization. So the creation of mortals for the ancient Greeks is very telling for their understanding of where they fit in the universe and exactly what their relationship is to their gods. Now, for the Greeks, as we mentioned, there is no book of Genesis. There is no telling of how mankind was created, which was of central importance, not only to the primary Abrahamic faiths of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but every culture throughout the world has an origin myth of exactly where human beings originated. For the ancient Greeks, very interesting, they had little interest starting off in the origin of mortals. Hesiod, for instance, has no explanation whatsoever in his works and days. Later explanations that come along after the written account of Hesiod are often contradictory, but most of them agree that Prometheus created man, not woman, but man. Now, the fascination of exactly where humans came from is, of course, going to be central to our search for identity and is common across all cultures, and we still see it in science fiction and literature today. Now, the story that leads to the creation of man really begins with the Titanomachy, which clears the way for the earth in which we can then inhabit it. So before then, you have the Titans, these primordial forces that are far too destructive to allow humans to thrive and civilization to be born. So after the decade-long battle with the Titans and the Olympians, of course, come out on top. As we mentioned, there are only two Titans that side with the Olympians, Prometheus and his brother Themis. Now, these are going to be very important in the story of the creation of man and then of woman. As the creation myth goes, according to Ovid, the great Roman mythographer that we'll talk about, we find that the Titans are overthrown by their children, the Olympians, except for the two that side with them. Of those, Prometheus is instructed to create man, inventing him in the image of the gods to worship them. In art, we often see this shown as a man giving fire to the first man, that being the one that's created by Prometheus, in the image of the gods. Because as you remember, for the ancient Greeks, the gods are merely mortals that cannot die and are relatively perfect in physical form. Ovid provides the fullest description of the creation of man that he pieces together from these earlier stories, which becomes the official story for the Middle Ages and what later traditions believed antiquity thought happened. So Prometheus will fashion man by mixing primeval earth together in water and then forming an image in the shape of the gods, exactly as Yahweh had to form Adam from earth in Genesis 2:4. So we find that the process is relatively consistent with many cultures that find that man turns back into earth or dirt once he dies. So it only makes sense that he was made or fashioned from it and then given the spark of life. Now, how this spark is given is different in the Judeo-Christian tradition than in the Greek tradition, as you see here, with Athena giving man understanding and reason. It is not surprising then to learn that Prometheus is considered to be the protector of mortals. He defends them against the gods, as we will discuss. His name actually means forelearner. He is clever, just like his relative Metis, the first consort of Zeus, who he consumed with his pregnant daughter Athena. Her name means cleverness, so he took that into himself, and Zeus becomes even more clever and smart. Now, the name actually comes from an Indo-European root for thief, in which you have this type of folk tale of a trickster whose brother, Epimetheus, is going to be named the afterlearner, or the dummy, and he will be very important when it comes to Pandora, the first woman, as he is tricked into wanting her. So Zeus is going to be jealous and fearful of this Titan Prometheus. So therefore, we find Prometheus tricks Zeus with a sacrifice, according to Hesiod. He conceals the desirable part of meat and of a sacrificed ox in haggis or a stomach, which is not appealing by appearance. And he conceals the bones in shining fat, which is what is desirable to eat in the slaughtered ox. And he allows Zeus to choose something that looks desirable but is going to be hollow and just has bones inside, or the best parts of meat that are hid inside of something that is undesirable. Zeus is going to choose what looks desirable, but then only gets the bones. This is the etiological myth explaining why the ancient Greeks ate the meat of their sacrifices and then burned the bones. The smoke was for the gods because they ate ambrosia, not physical food. But this is how they explain why they do not give the best part of the animal to the gods. Zeus is, of course, enraged at how he was tricked by Prometheus, so he retaliates by removing fire from the trees, which were lit by his lightning strikes, thus, of course, those lightning bolts fashioned by the Cyclops, or from rubbing sticks together. Now, without lightning and fire, we find man begins to starve because they were accustomed to eating cooked meat. And so you find that Prometheus is going to have pity on his creation, pity on man, and does something about it, going against Zeus. He pities us and then steals fire, hiding this fire in a fennel stalk, which is a fire-resistant plant at the time used to transport live coals from one fire to the next. So it was constant labor to gather fuel to maintain a fire and unrelenting work. But instead now, using this type of transport, he gives man the technology to make their own fire, thus, of course, having the power of the gods. In his betrayal, it was felt by Zeus, he is going to punish Prometheus. And this is very popular in many traditions, ordering him to be bound by strength and violence, Kratos and Bia. These are children of the river Styx. They bind Prometheus to the pillars in the Caucasus Mountains, an actual place that he will be freed by Hercules much later. Every night, of course, we find that an eagle would come and eat his liver, and of course it would regenerate because he was immortal. A horrible way to live day in and day out, being eaten alive by Zeus's eagle. Now, the actual location of all of these myths are real, and so the Greeks found real places to locate their myths, because for them, of course, they actually occurred and the gods live in actual physical geographical locations. In this case, in the north of modern-day Iraq. Now we find that the idea of Kratos, or strength, is going to be adopted by many different types of writers of fiction, and of course the popular video game series God of War. And so the myths are enduring, tied to the myth of Prometheus bound. The eagle that comes to eat his liver is going to be the symbol of Zeus, and we find is often accompanying Zeus. Here we find that Atlas is going to be shown with Prometheus. Both of them had, of course, offended the gods. Obviously, Atlas fought on the wrong side in the Titanomachy, and Prometheus went behind Zeus's back and also tricked him into being given the less desirable part of a sacrifice. Now, by the time we get to the Renaissance, Vulcan became the universal forger for the gods, and he then creates the technology necessary to bind Prometheus, this Titan. So Mercury is going to be the deceptive god, like Prometheus's deception, giving technology to mortals. So here we see why Mercury is going to be shown while he is bound by Vulcan. Now, the real-life punishment for criminals reflects this practice that the Greeks would have known about, and it's called exposure, in which someone convicted of a capital crime would be suspended outside of a city on a breaking wheel, in which you would find they would take bats or clubs and break their limbs and leave them to die, and then, of course, the birds and other animals to eat their carcasses. A horrific way to suffer, just as Prometheus had suffered. So they're tying in this notion of the suffering of this Titan to their own experiences in capital punishment during the day. Now, the crucifixion is another form of this type of punishment, in which it's going to be found that Christ is crucified at Golgotha, the place of the skull outside the city. So the warnings against transgressing some type of social norm or law is reinforced in these public displays of execution. In Aeschylus, we find he writes Prometheus bound around 430 BCE. In this tragedy, Prometheus is going to describe himself what he conferred on mortals. As Aeschylus writes, early humans were rude, witless, and savage. Prometheus taught them brickmaking, woodworking, and technology, the calendar, numbers, and writing, animal husbandry, seafaring technology, medicine, metallurgy, prophecy, and more. Therefore, Prometheus is the great benefactor of mankind and our protector. So in the end, of course, we have to free Prometheus because he's so important for early man. Heracles is going to kill the eagle that is going to be tearing out his liver every evening. But at this point, Zeus did not object because of the prophecy Prometheus reveals, in which you find Achilles will be born. So the Titan explains to Hercules afterwards that there is a prophecy where Achilles would be born to Peleus and Thetis. And of course, we find that Zeus's wife is very happy about this because Zeus does not take Thetis, this sea nymph, as a consort, and instead a great hero will emerge that will fight in the Trojan War. So Zeus is going to punish man, nevertheless, for Prometheus's theft of fire with the greatest affliction the ancient Greeks could think of, woman. This is, of course, accounted for in Hesiod's Theogony and the Works and Days. This is the ideological myth of the origin of woman, of marriage, and how suffering comes into the world. Obviously, the Greeks are very misogynistic and very sexist. Now, like Prometheus, Zeus is going to offer something that looked good on the outside, this type of deception, but instead is going to be hollow or undesirable on the inside, like the bones he was given as a sacrifice. Just as we find in the Judeo-Christian tradition that woman comes out of the side of man, we have this companionship set up, yet also in the original tradition taught by the church, she brings the downfall of mankind and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, bringing original sin into the world for transgressing God's commandment that they should not eat from the tree of knowledge. In a similar fashion, we find Pandora is going to really act as an early Eve for this tradition. So Zeus is going to have Hephaestus, later known as Vulcan, form woman out of water and clay, much the same way Prometheus had made man. He adds speech and strength to this and the face of a maiden, something that is desirable. Athena is going to also add womanly skill, which is why women are expected to learn handicraft and how to weave. Aphrodite crowns her with desire, so all that look upon her would desire her, much as Helen, who of course created the situation for the Trojan War with her beauty. Hermes is going to give her thievish morals and added, quote, the soul of a bitch, which means, of course, that of a dog. And so you find that in the original tradition, women are subhuman. They're a different species than man as they saw it, which explained why in this hegemonic system in ancient Greece that women didn't have the same rights as men. Hermes is then going to bring Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, the dummy, this woman, who Prometheus warned never to accept gifts from the gods, much as later the Trojan priest Laocoon will warn never to accept the gifts of Greeks. So she is often shown here rising from the ground, rising from the original female Gaia, Mother Earth. Epimetheus is often shown holding a hammer, that of Hephaestus, indicating the one who created her, while Hermes and Zeus look on knowingly at one another as he is going to be falling into this trap of theirs, of taking this object that looks desirable and beautiful, but brings suffering and misery. So here you can find one of the most popular images where at the far right, Pandora is going to be rising from the ground to meet her new bride, while Zeus and Hermes, who also concocted this, this machination, this facade, are going to be looking on at what's happening. Here we have Prometheus and Pandora. You'll notice in the Renaissance, they're often conceived of as the original Adam and Eve and shown as such for a Christian audience to parallel the creation of woman with the creation of Eve. Now, men in this original tradition lived in a golden age, according to myth, before woman was created, and this age was without death or without disease. So Pandora literally means all giver. So she was given a jar with a heavy lid that allowed all to escape but hope. So it is a jar that she has, not a box in the tradition as it develops in the Middle Ages. So often she is referred to and shown in later art as Eva Prima Pandora, or the first Eve Pandora, as seen here, where you see she's leaning on a skull and has a serpent winding around her left hand holding her jar. So she brings suffering and death into the world. This is the explanation for the Greeks as to how this happened. Literally living in a Garden of Eden-like paradise before she came along. In the Middle Ages, this tradition is corrupted into a box, given several misinterpretations and mistranslations. And it was understood that the gods told Pandora not to open it, but of course she did, releasing all the ills of the world. Now, like biblical folk tales, this is a violation of prohibition that we'll talk about several times in this class. When the gods tell you not to do something and mortals do it anyway, they suffer. They said, do not open the jar, just as in Genesis, Adam and Eve are told to not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because of this transgression and the violation of this prohibition, evil enters the world, suffering and death enter the world in both of these examples. So in the Christian tradition, this is understood as the moment that Eve is going to take the fruit and convince Adam to eat the fruit. Thus, she takes on most of the negative associations and the blame for this. So man then is forced to survive by the sweat of his brow as he's forced out of the Garden of Eden. Woman is punished even worse as she must suffer through childbirth from this point onwards. So Pandora's descendants are a different race than that of men, and according to the Greeks, contribute nothing to food production. They do not work in the fields, tending the flocks, etc. They only consume as containers. Therefore, women are often referred to in Greek myth and tradition as jars because they are containers. They fill up their stomach, they hold life in their uterus, and of course, they're going to hold ashes of their dead husbands later on. So we have this association of a woman as a jar. And thus, of course, a woman who is broken is a broken jar we'll talk about. So Prometheus is going to hide the good sacrifice in an unappetizing stomach, just as Pandora in this tradition, as the Greeks understand it, is a useless stomach that doesn't provide anything. So there is no hope of abandoning women as the Greeks saw it, because they are necessary, or a necessary evil, as the Greeks would say, because they require marriage, and marriage leads to procreation. So if you want a son, and if you want a family, and you want your name to live on, you must marry. Therefore, we find there is this love-hate relationship built into the gender dynamic of men and women in antiquity. So whoever keeps clear of marriage, the saying goes, must expect a gloomy old age with no one at hand to attend him. Therefore, it's understood that if you do not get married, if you do not find a woman and she does not have children for you, then you're going to die old and alone, because no one will be there to care for you and no one will carry on your name, making you immortal. So offspring is the only way for the ancient Greeks to gain immortality. It's very important to remember, because they do not have an understanding of heaven and hell like later Christians. They're all going to the gloomy afterlife in Hades to wander around aimlessly. So if they want to be immortal and their name to carry on in a heroic fashion or in any fashion, they need children. So in Hebrews, we find that this fear of women and, of course, this misogyny is built into the Christian and Jewish traditions as well. For there is a fear of a woman's menses. As Leviticus also tells us, anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. So we find even the process of being a woman and regular biological functions are anathema to men, and they're afraid of them. The Greeks' misogyny is, of course, even more pronounced, for there is a resentment of this institution of monogamy. So Greek myth is going to reveal these hostile relations between the sexes and married couples. As we often find, they are going to be fighting and quarreling with one another, even leading to homicide. Now, women, again, are understood as containers. Now, in tradition and in myth, we see this carrying over into daily life, for they daily would carry water to their house in watering jars called hydriae. And so this is a stand-in for what they do and who they are. So women would also carry baskets for sacrificial accoutrement and would also receive vessels from other women. Never men, they would receive vessels from women, especially at weddings. This would be a wedding gift, is to give a woman a vessel like this. So pregnant women are also called closed jars. They are not open because the womb is closed, carrying a child. So we find that all of this is going to lead to this association of Pandora having a vessel because she is a vessel. So the Danaids are one of the great examples that we will return to, for they are women who refuse marriage and when forced into it, kill their husbands on their wedding night in a solidarity of homicide. They are then condemned to carry water in broken jugs forever, symbols of their own bodies, because they did not accept that they were vessels. They killed their husbands, one of the worst offenses imaginable for the Greeks, next to eating one's children. So earth and jars contain and consume. Therefore, you find a jar is equated to a womb that holds babies. A jar can also be an urn that holds the cremated remains of one's dead husband or relatives. Therefore, the womb can also be understood as a tomb. Men come from it and they return to it. Now, we find there are 5 races according to Hesiod, and in these different races, we see the evolution from the creation of man to woman. So in the days of Cronus and the Titans, we have a golden age according to this tradition, which of course, again, makes no sense because we find the Titans must be overthrown for man to be created by Prometheus, but there are many different traditions we just have to understand to move forward. So we find that in the days of Cronus, we have this golden age where mortals are happy. Then they became spirits at death. In the Silver Age, we find that it's worse than the first because the first grow old and die at this time. They are violent. They do not respect the gods. And upon death, the spirits are then going to return to the underground, much like we would see that they would go down to Hades later in this tradition. The Bronze Age is even worse than the Silver Age because we have bronze weapons. And at death, when men died, they descended to Hades in darkness, further carrying on this tradition that everyone goes to Hades. Then finally, we have the Age of Heroes in this 4th age, which is better than the Bronze Age because it has the Trojan War. So some heroes didn't have to die. They instead went on to the Isles of the Blessed. And this is, of course, a paradise for the ancient Greeks and Romans we'll talk about, called Elysium. Now, finally, the Iron Age is when Hesiod actually lived in the present day. Thus, of course, they look back to these golden ages before there was death, before one had to suffer or go to Hades, before man was violent. So we find that this replaces the Bronze Age, but again, iron corrodes a lot faster than bronze, and so people don't live as long in this tradition. The division is actually taken from a Persian tradition and is also repeated in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verses 31. Here we find that Virgil reimagines the ages to repeat it in sequence, as Augustus's represents a new golden age. Thus we find when the Roman Empire is founded, this is propaganda. So these ages come back around to show that we have revived this age of paradise, of people, animals, and creatures living in harmony. Now, the universal flood, as we see here in Genesis 6, 7 through 8, actually states that I will blot out humans, for I am sorry that I have made them. So in the same way, we find that there are different traditions as to how the creators are sorry that they have actually created mankind. Now, George Smith, the Assyriologist, is going to write in 1872 that he discovered the first deluge, the account on the 3rd millennium BCE tablet. In it, we find that the Assyrians had gods that decided to destroy humankind. Specifically, Enki is going to intervene to save the righteous and tells him to build a large boat. The Akkadian myth of 1700 BCE finds as well that the righteous man is saved by Ea, who builds a huge boat to lock inside animals and his family. The Mesopotamian myth finds that the deluge is to correct for overpopulation, explaining barren wombs and stillbirths. And finally, the Hebrews are going to find that punishment for moral failure is why the floods actually occurred, also explaining why the Hebrews don't eat blood and don't murder others. The Greco-Roman understanding of this punishment from the gods is going to be for moral failure as well. For Zeus discovers mankind, as you watched in the documentary, practicing cannibalism, so he punishes them for it. After the flood, in the Greco-Roman tradition, the two righteous survive, Pyrrha being one of them, and their children found each of the Greek regions. Thus, the creation myths only consider one's own race and one's own region. We find that every one of these civilizations is retelling the same story, usually from some type of transgression on the part of mortals, but no one has a story that actually considers all of the others around them. So we find that they generally will only consider the Hebrews, or just the Greeks, or just the Romans, or just the Assyrians. So we find that that is the creation myth that we see across nearly all cultures. So this is how humans are going to fall from a godlike state to the current state of mortality that we have, where we must suffer and die. It's because of Prometheus's trick that Zeus is upset, that he would sacrifice in this way that would define the human world as midway between the gods and animals. For we eat animals, and then the gods enjoy the smoke from the offerings. So Prometheus's second trick led to woman, thus death and suffering in the world. In the next class, we will turn to the myths associated with the great male gods, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, as well as Zeus's wife Hera.